Hey everybody, what's going on? Hexlex here. Got another Master Duel video for you. So I figured it was time to do another tier list for Master Duel here. Usually I do these like once per season, but we've definitely seen a pretty significant meta change with the most recent selection pack. So I figured we'd go ahead and do an updated one. My last tier list was a few days before the start of Season 21. So at that time, I didn't include the new decks like PURRELY and Mikanko on the list because I wasn't sure exactly how they would affect the meta. But now that we're, I think, a little over, almost coming up on 2 weeks of the packs having been legal here in Master Duel, these new archetypes, and I feel at this point I'm fairly comfortable sussing out where they belong here on the tier list. So we're going to go ahead and talk about, of course, not just those 2 decks, but actually 40 of what I consider to be some of the top decks here in Master Duel. So as always as ever, I want to have a little bit of a preface before we start on the tier list here, right? As they tend to be, this tier list is pretty subjective, so this is where I honestly think each deck places in the meta, right? I'm going to try to, remove all biases, and this is my honest opinion of where I think every deck lies. I'll say about this meta as a whole, I actually pretty like it. I like it a lot, pretty much. I think that it's a pretty good format right now that we're in because it's relatively wide open. Like, I think this is, and I predicted this was going to be the case, a few weeks ago when we were doing the last tier list, that this meta, the gap between tier 1 and 2 is not very wide at all. And in fact, I think that we're in a pretty healthy meta as a result, right? When the tiers have like very wide gaps, especially when it's between 1 and everything else, then we're in more of like a tier 0 state where the meta decks are just so far above everything else that it feels like it's hard to compete with other decks. But here, I mean, all 40 of these decks, and this is kind of the other caveat I wanted to give, right? All 40 of these decks, and also decks not shown here, are more than capable of hitting Master and Master 1. That's true of, like, honestly, literally any season, as long as you're teching for the format and you know your matchups and, of course, the deck you're playing well enough. But I think it is especially true in this meta. So let's not waste any more time. Let's go ahead and get right into rating these decks. Starting off with, as represented by Alubur, the Jester of Despia, Branded Despia. I'm going to put Branded Despia in tier 2. I think Branded Despia is probably just about the top of tier 2. The limitation that it suffered, of course, recently was Branded Fusion going from 2 copies to 1, which, don't get me wrong, is a pretty big hit. Of course, Branded Fusion is the deck's most centric card, as in, pretty much all of its plays kind of center around it. Of course, it can make plays without the card, but it is definitely the archetype's defining a card. Despite that, the deck does not really play very differently at all, and I kind of predict that this was going to be the case. If anything, it just becomes a little bit more common to play Branded Retribution, even at 2 copies now, just to be able to consistently get back your Branded Fusion. So, but Branded Despia as a deck as a whole, I think is really in a really, really good spot here in Master Duel right now. It's been tier 2, honestly, for a long time now, so I think ever since Sprite came in, that was, like, I think the first big deck that kind of pushed it down from tier 1 to tier 2, but definitely still a good investment, as it is still a good deck, and it will, of course, being an Albaz Lord deck, get new support in the future. So, Branded Despia, tier 2, and towards the top of it. Punk is going to be the next deck that we'll talk about here. This is going to kind of encompass both the Bestial / Chaos Punk variants as well as the Kashtira Punk variants, which a lot of people have been asking me if I'm going to cover Kashtira Punk. Don't worry, that video is coming. It should be coming tomorrow, actually, so it'll be coming very, very soon here. I think Punk is a pretty solid tier 3 deck. In the past, I think it was Rogue, but I think the meta shift has tended to favor it, as a lot of the decks that were just more powerful were kind of keeping Punk variants from seeing a little bit more play. But Punk is one of those kind of pretty consistent forces in the meta. Kashtira Punk does seem to be the most popular variant, with the more chaosy Punk piles kind of trailing behind it. But all in all, it's still a very, very solid deck. It plays very well going first, of course, to end on, at the very least, multiple bounces with the Amazing Dragon, but often some negates as well. And it has a pretty good going second planned, where you can, again, make Amazing Dragon to bounce, or just try to end the duel quickly with the Psychic End Punisher. Pep Towers monsters in general are pretty good in this particular meta, so any deck that can make one is definitely fairly well poised. And speaking of decks that can make towers, Marinesis is going to be the deck that we're talking about next. And because of its ability to make the Aqua Argonaut with, the unaffected, I think with the Link 2, right? With the field spell. It's actually in a pretty good position right now. It is still going to be a rogue deck, but again, as always ever, decks that are rogue are, of course, still very, very playable, and I would still consider them meta. It seems that a lot of people have different definitions of, like, what's rogue and what's not. But for me, I tend to be very selective about what actually goes in tiers 1, 2, and 3, right? To me, tiers 1, 2, and 3 are definitely the most, like, relevant decks of the meta. Like, you can expect to see these decks with a good amount of regularity. That tends to be less true with Rogue, but decks that are in Rogue are still going to be, of course, very competitive and very capable of hitting Master and Master 1. So, I'm not only factoring in power level when I make these ratings, but I'm also factoring in usage rate and frequency, or at least how often I see them, not only myself in Diamond and Master Ladder, but in tournaments and so on and so forth, on Master Duel meta, etc. So, Marinesis, it doesn't see a whole lot of play, but I do think it is very well poised in the meta. Again, I think any deck that can make it towers is right now. And yet another deck that can make it towers is the Ad Ignister deck. One thing I'll say about Ad Ignister is that, of course, being a more long-form combo deck, it's got a lot more choke points. I think even more so than Marinesis, probably. I don't know too much about Marinesis, but Ad Ignister I've played before, and I can definitely tell you it uses, like, every single point of interaction, right? It searches from deck, it, like, summons from grave, it does everything that can get hit with pretty much any form of hand trap. It goes well over 5 summons, it needs on-field effects, etc., etc. So, I think the deck is also rogue. I'll put it below Marinesis. I think they're pretty comparable in power level, but I do think that Marinesis tends to be a little bit better, probably, than the Ad Ignister deck right now. Panda Magician. Panda Magician is kind of another one of those decks that's been pretty much in the same spot that it's been since the start of Master Duel, or since it's been in Master Duel, which has been the start. And that's going to be upper rogue. I'm definitely, if it'll let me put it there, yeah, I'll definitely put it above Marinesis and Ad Ignister. I think Pen Magician is a very good deck. It's one of those decks that is definitely very pilot dependent, right? Like, people who are really, really experienced and skilled with Pendulum decks are going to be able to take them further. A lot more consistently, I think, than a lot of other archetypes. Like, if you look at a lot of tournament results, especially, Pendulum decks, like Pendulum Magician especially, not only, like, still sees consistent tops, but even wins, like, still very regularly as well. So, Pen Magician, a very strong rogue deck. It's definitely one of those decks that you need a lot of time to learn, relative to other decks, that is. But once you get the hang of it, if you can master a deck like this, then you can definitely take it to very great heights. How often can I say very in a sentence? Holy moly. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next deck here. That's going to be Branded Tearlament. It is not a variant of Tearlament that I've seen around very often lately, which kind of surprises me. I think when it comes to trying out different Tearlament variants and trying to make Tearlament work in this meta, personally, I think I'm going to go to Branded Tearlament next. But Tearlament as a whole is, of course, at an all-time low in terms of popularity since the ban of Merly, and that has not really changed much since the ban list went into effect. This is one thing that I was actually a little bit wrong about, I think, and it could just still be a case of people not experimenting enough, but I knew that Tearlament was going to be unpopular, right, going into the new meta, but I didn't think the popularity was going to tank as hard as it was, and I'm starting to wonder now if that it's a matter of people not wanting to try Tearlament, or if Tearlament really is just that far fallen from the Merly ban. Either way, I think the Merly ban was honestly genius. Like, it's not super duper often that I give props to Konami, because I give it when I think it's deserved. But I will say that I think that the decision to ban Merly was honestly genius. Like, I'll just be frank. Like, it was a very, very good call. And I think it ended up being the perfect hit to Tearlaments. So, branded Tearlaments, I do not think it is the best branded variant by any means, but it might actually be the best Tearlament variant, which has not been true up until this point. I'm still going to put it in Rogue, because, like, when do you ever see this deck anymore? I've seen it, like, maybe twice since the ban list went into effect, but, yeah, definitely due to usage rate, it's going to be more towards the bottom of Rogue, and I don't know, we'll see about Tearlaments. It might be there due to power as well. All right, I wanted to talk about the Galaxy Photon deck next. This is, of course, one of the decks that got new support in the latest selection pack. Galaxy Photon hasn't really been relevant, before it got this new support, and I'm going to be honest here, I really don't think it's very relevant afterward. the thing about Galaxy Photon, right, and I decided to put it here on the tier list because, one, even if I don't think it's the most relevant deck, I do think it is still, of course, with the right pilot, as any other rogue deck, capable of hitting Master or Master 1. But the thing, too, about the new Galaxy support, and this is kind of a recurring trend whenever this deck does seem to get new support, is that it seems like it gets yet another boss monster that's, like, really big and really, like, unaffected by stuff, and or has a really, like, powerful effect, which is, like, nice and all, but, like, at this rate, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say this archetype has a dozen monsters like this, and it does not need more. The deck needs to be more consistent. It needs more starters and searchers. I don't think it needs more extenders. I think it's actually fine on those from what little I know about the archetype, but yeah, we definitely do not need more boss monsters for this deck, but it seems that Konami wants to go in that direction with Galaxy Photon. It's going to end up being Rogue, and I am going to even put it below Branded Tier Element. It sees more play than the deck, but if I had to pick which I think is the stronger deck in a, like, you know, ranked ladder more consistently, I think that Branded Tier Element is going to end up being better than Galaxy Photon overall. To be fair, I've not faced off against the deck once, Galaxy Photon, and then I've never played it myself with all the current support, so maybe it's a little bit better than I'm giving credit for, but yeah, just based on my experience, I'm going to put it here more towards the bottom of Rogue. So Sword Soul. Sword Soul I put at the top of Tier 2 on our last tier list. Here I am going to move it up to Tier 1. I was a little bit hesitant to put it in Tier 1 during our last tier list, just because I wasn't sure exactly how the meta was going to shake out. But Sword Soul, I mean, God, I see this every tier list we talk about Sword Soul, right? It's just been, like, in terms of consistency, the best deck to play in Master Duel. I don't think it's fallen down to Tier 3 personally. Even in Tier 0 meta. You know, I've said before, like, oh, maybe it wasn't Tier 0 meta, but last time I said that in a video or on stream, wherever I said it, a lot of people made good points that, like, Sword Soul was actually really good in Tier 0 meta, because you could play multiple Protos to call Dark, you could really tech out for that matchup, and of course you were going to run into that matchup a lot, so you could tech stuff like DD Crows before the Bystials came in, etc. So, yeah, I mean, Sword Soul has been in a great position literally since it released in Master Duel in May 2022. So, yeah, it's been Tier 1 or Tier 2 the whole time. And, again, there will come a point where it's going to start to go down in play. But I've said that before, and we've not seen it happen just yet. Again, here we are, you know, almost a year and a half after the deck's release in the game, and it's still a Tier 1 deck. So, gotta love Sword Soul. Good old reliable. Alright, Mathmech is the deck I want to talk about next. So Mathmech I put at the top of Tier 3 last time, and I said that it was a deck that I expected people to sleep on, but I think if enough people played it, it could be a Tier 2 deck. And I have been noticing as I've been browsing Master Duel meta, right, and we're looking at tournament results, that a decent amount of Mathmech decks have actually been doing well since the ban list. And again, I did kind of expect this to be the case, mostly because of Bystials. Not fully leaving the meta, of course. There are still a lot of decks in the meta that like to play the Bystial monsters, but a lot of decks were teching Bystials that might not normally because of tier limits. But with tier limit going from the undisputed top tier 1 deck to now, well, we'll talk about tier limit itself here in a little while. But yeah, with tier limit definitely falling from grace, like, I think that the Bystials are seeing an all-time low since their introduction in terms of the usage rate here in Master Duel. So, in turn, that isn't very good for Mathmech. Now, once Kashtira's Good Rise Heart, which is supposed to be actually happening in the next selection pack from what I hear, you know, then it'll be a little bit of a different story, and Mathmech, I think, will once again have a little bit more of a difficult time. But for the time being, it's a good time to be a Mathmech player. I would like to put this deck in Tier 2, but I think it's best to put it at the top of Tier 3, which is where I had it last time. And it's actually in that kind of exact same position, right? Where I think it's a Tier 2 deck. And if I were letting my bias, you know, speak a little bit louder than the results that we're seeing in tournaments and ladder, I would put Mathmech in Tier 2. But I think it's fair to put it more towards the top of Tier 3. It's in a good position overall. Thunder Dragons. Thunder Dragon is kind of like Pen Magician, where it's more towards the top of Rogue. That is where I'm going to end up putting it. It's kind of been there since the start of Master Duel, and it's a deck that definitely favors players who know it very well. It is another one of those kind of more skill-intensive decks. I will say that Thunder Dragon was better when tier limit was tier 1, again, because of the Bestial effect here, right? Thunder Dragon is one of those decks that will pretty much always play Bestials no matter what. Bestials will always be good in the deck because Thunder Dragon is light and dark based and very much likes to have its stuff banished. So in that regard, you know, Thunder Dragon is always going to play those cards, but obviously in a meta where the Bestials can also snipe the best deck and really hit it hard, then Thunder Dragon as a whole tends to get better. So in the past, I would have debated that Thunder Dragon even, you know, recently was towards the bottom of tier 3, but I think I'm pretty comfortable leaving it here in upper rogue. It's another one of those decks you kind of see in tournaments a little bit more frequently than ladder. Dinosaurs. I don't know. I don't really face off against this deck very often. I think I'm going to put it, like, right around here. Like, I think it's definitely above, like, branded tier, but I think it's probably about on par with these, like, Cybers kind of tower turbo decks. Marine System, Arrival, Cyber, Savvy Mister. But, you know, Dinos, of course, like a lot of long-form combo decks, have a lot of choke points, but if the combo resolves, it is an extremely powerful one. Dogmatica is a deck that I have consistently been impressed with every time I watch it play or I face off against it on ladder. It's one of those decks that, honestly, if it were up to me and just me and I had never played against it, I probably wouldn't even consider ranking it. But because I have actually faced off against it a decent number of times, I can definitely acknowledge that, especially with more recent support, the deck, it does definitely have more than a fighting chance. It's actually pretty good in the current metagame. I'm going to put it in Rogue. I'm probably going to put it, like, I'd say about on par with Dinos, maybe a little bit lower, but like mid-Rogue tier, I guess is where I would say that Dogmatica is at. Again, while it's not the strongest deck you could play, it is definitely still capable of seeing a lot of success. Spiral. Spiral is going to be one of these, again, kind of upper Rogue decks that, you know, are more geared towards players who are dedicated towards this one particular deck. Spiral is a very nuanced deck with a very nuanced combo line, but with various ban list releases and terms of odd support here and there, the deck has actually been slowly and steadily getting a little bit better as time goes on. It's definitely not tier 3. Like, it's weird, right? Because this deck was like so OP in the past. It was a tier 0 deck, and right now it's like almost at full power. It's like pretty much at full power, but the game as a whole has definitely power crept past where Spiral... Well, I don't know about if it has definitely power crept where Spiral once was. You also got to figure that there was the Firewall Dragon, right? I think that was part of the OTK, and that was definitely the obscene card, but Spiral as a whole is still, of course, very, very good, but not tier 0. But again, if you learn the deck, you can definitely consistently do well with it. Alright, Draco Slayers is another one of these Pendulum decks here. This one, where would I put Draco Slayers? I don't know. It's kind of one of those decks that I feel has fallen off a bit since it came out. Not in the most recent pack, but I think the one before, right? We came out with Kashira stuff. So now that the new deck hype has worn off, it's funny, and I think I've talked about this before. There are, I think, TCG players who were kind of swearing that, like, Draco Slayer is so good. If only it didn't come out with Kashira full power, and if only, you know, we had Electromite, then this deck would definitely be tier 1. Well, you know, here we are in Master Duel. We have Electromite, and Kashira really isn't doing much of anything right now. You know, of course that'll change when the second wave of support comes out, but right now doesn't really do too much in Master Duel. So Draco Slayer, I think, has had pretty much its best opportunity that it's ever going to get, and it is definitely not tier 1. But it's still a good rogue deck. I'll put it, you know, I'll kind of compare it with, like, Dogmatica and Dino in, like, maybe mid to lower, but mid rogue tier. Zodiac, I haven't rated Zodiac in quite some time, but Zodiac has actually been performing pretty well recently. The addition of Kashira monsters, of course, Fenrir, but the Kashiras actually slide in pretty nicely to Zodiac. Like, you can definitely play Fenrirs, and you can even play Unicorn too if you want to. So the deck also, of course, has the ability to, I think more so than just about any other deck on this tier list, play a lot of very meta-specific disruption that's really good. So, like, it's also a deck that really doesn't mind going second, so it can play Kaijus, it can play Drolls, it can play these cards that a lot of decks wouldn't necessarily want to play because they don't have the space for it, but, you know, Zodiac, the main deck package is very non-committal. It's very few cards, so the main deck ends up being really wide open there. Zodiac, again, I haven't even ranked it recently, but I think it's actually been improving a lot in terms of its position in the meta. I'd still put it mid-rogue, but it's definitely a better spot than Zodiac has been in the past. Flander, good old Flo. No matter how many hits it takes, the deck just will not die. I think Konami's definitely going to have something to say about that at some point in the future. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if we saw Rabita get semi-limited. I don't think the deck deserves that hit. I definitely don't think the deck deserves all the hits it's gotten up to this point. But the problem with Flo for Konami is that it's cheap. And it doesn't require, you know, a lot of future investment. In fact, it really doesn't require any future investment in terms of, like, upcoming support. So, in that regard, I think Konami is definitely trying to oust it, and it's kind of transparent at this point. Flog, honestly, Flog. I was gonna say Flo isn't rogue. Excuse me. I would put Flo in tier 3. And I'd put it, like, honestly, mid to upper tier 3. You definitely still see it a decent bit on ladder, and I don't know about you, but like Flo, like it's kind of one of my least favorite decks ever to play against. So the fact that we still see it is a little bit annoying to me, but you know, it is what it is, and I don't think it is definitely as it's definitely not as bad as it's been in the past. So Evil Eye is, I think, one of those decks that, again, it's rogue mostly because while not as powerful as some of the more tiered decks, it does still offer a lot of, you know, it does still have the ability to play well in the meta with a pilot who knows the deck well. I'd probably put it around the same level as like Zodiac and, you know, these other mid-level tier decks. That's kind of a consistent trend in Rogue, especially, and again, I kind of talked about this already, but with tier 3 and up, these are definitely the more relevant decks in terms of power level, where, you know, you can pick this deck up, and while you're learning it, the power level of the deck, it won't completely carry you by any means, but you can definitely do pretty well just because of the deck strength, even as you're learning it. Whereas Rogue decks, as you pick them up, you're probably going to suffer more losses, but then you know, it favors more over time, where the more you play with the deck, the better position you end up being in, because, you know, the decks are less known overall. Other players will be less able to play against you. All right, now we'll talk about stun just for a moment, though, because there's really not much to say about stun. It's a pretty consistent force in the meta. I do think the number of floodgates we have in Master Duel is fine. Like, obviously, when the game started, like, it definitely was pretty apparent pretty quickly that 3 skill drain and vanities and imperial order and 3 rivalry and 3 Gozen, you know, etc., was definitely too much. But now I think stun is like, I don't know, I'm gonna make a semi-controversial statement and say it's fine. There are a lot of people who think the floodgates should outright be banned and not be a part of Yu-Gi-Oh at all. I disagree with that. I don't think that floodgates are like, I don't think it's healthy if a floodgate deck is like really, really good, but I think it's fine for stun to be where it's at, which is like mid to lower rogue. I'll definitely put it below, like, you know, Dogmatica and Draco Slayers and such. So, yeah, that's pretty much how I feel about stun right now. Blackwing, I've definitely kind of seen fall off a little bit lately, I'm not going to lie. Not just in terms of, like, I mean, you never really see it too much on ladder, but I don't know, I feel like before it would at least put up a decent amount of, like, tournament results here and there, but I just haven't really seen it do anything, honestly, lately. I don't think it's a bad deck by any means, but normally I put Blackwing at, like, the top of Rogue. I'm going to move it down a little bit, where I think it's, you know, I think it's still, like, an upper Rogue deck, just not quite as good as some of these other ones that we're seeing here, like Pen Magician and Spiral and such, so. Let's see, Sprite variant number 1 is going to be Fur Higher Sprite. I honestly just never see this deck, so it's really hard for me to say. I think of the relevant Sprite variants, like the most played ones, it's probably the weakest, but, you know, being a weak Sprite variant does not mean you are a weak deck overall, because Sprite, I think, as a whole is generally pretty good. So, I'm going to put this in, like, mid-rogue, probably around the same level as, like, you know, Evil Eye, Adagnister or such. Definitely a solid Sprite variant, but there are better ones. Okay, Pure Sprite. This is going to be difficult for me, because I think everybody knows where I want to put this deck based on my experiences with it. I think this deck is still tier 1, but I'm gonna be good and remove my biases, like I said I was going to, and I'm gonna put Sprite in tier 2. This, of course, is referring to, like, pure Sprite variants. I do think this more objectively than subjectively. Well, both, but I don't know. I do think that Pure Sprite is the best variant. still to play. I do think it is still the strongest one. I've said this before in the numerous videos I've talked about Pure Sprite, but the limits of Swap Frog and Jet are not nearly as devastating as a lot of people have been saying. This is a very common rhetoric I see whenever I talk about sprites. It's like, oh, but Swap Frog's at 1, that's gotta suck. Like, what do you have to play random Dupe Frog? And it's like, playing the Dupe Frog is fine, honestly, because, and again, I've made this point before, but Swap Frog is most often, even when it was played at 3, Swap Frog was most often summoned off of Gigantic from the deck. So we still just do that exact same thing. And you do the exact same line with the Swap Frog by sending the Ronin and then the Dupe the second time you summon it off of Elf. And if you open with Dupe Frog, I mean, it's not really that different from opening like Nimble Angler or like these other random level 2s you play where it's like, it kind of sucks, but at the same time, as long as you open it alongside a Cashier Fenrir or like literally any Sprite monster, it's completely fine. You still have all your regular plays anyway. That is, I think, what makes Pure Sprite so good, is that like, you can play really mid level 2 monsters, and it's fine because as long as they're level 2, you can just fully combo out with them. It doesn't really matter what they do. Like, to a certain degree, if you could just guarantee to open Cashier Fenrir and or a Sprite monster every time, you could play like a vanilla level 2 monster and you could just still fully combo, right? So in that regard, I think that's what kind of makes Pure Sprite so good. Again, I think it's a tier 1 deck. I would put it up here. I really, really would. But removing my own biases, I think it's probably going to be a mid to lower tier 2 deck in its current iteration, given how often it's played and how well it's doing. I mean, it's doing pretty decently on ladder and in other and in like tournament results, just beyond my own personal experience. So there it is. All right, that was the big hurdle for me for this video. Tier limit. Woof. So I put tier limit in tier 2, and I really did think that's where it was going to be. And I think this was the thing I ended up being the most incorrect about. If I'm being completely and brutally honest about how often tier limit is played right now, tier limit's a rogue deck. That's wild to say. That is such a fall. That's one of the biggest fall from graces I think we've seen here in Master Duel so far. To see a deck go from before a ban list to being the undisputed best tier 1 deck in Master Duel, to now dropping to rogue all the way down through 2 tiers, that's rough. And honestly, I don't even know if tier limit is actually at the top of rogue. I'm putting it here because I think it is probably stronger than any of these other decks that I have put in rogue right now. But I don't know, it's hard to say. It's definitely at rogue level in terms of representation. I'm inclined to think, and again, this is where I'm trying to remove my own personal biases and attempting to make it a more kind of informed, or I guess somewhat objective tier list. But again, these are always subjective by nature. But whatever. I think tier limit's probably at least like tier 3. I don't think it's tier 2 where I had it before, but I do think it's probably tier 3 personally. It's just going to take more people experimenting with the deck and finding a good build, right? But given how often it's been played, I mean, how often have you seen tier limit? Like since, you know, the first couple of days after the ban list, I really haven't seen it at all. So we could even see it fall further into rogue next time I make one of these videos. But yeah, that's wild. Tier limit going down from tier 1 to rogue, but here we are. So all right, next up we're going to talk about Labyrinth. Labyrinth, I think, has been in a pretty good spot and about the same spot since it got the big welcome lab and lovely lady. No, lady. What is it? I always mix up their names. It's Lovely Lab and Lady Lab, right? The new big monster and the new big welcome. You know which cards I'm talking about. But I'm going to put Lab more towards like the bottom of tier 2. It kind of like, I think, could arguably even be tier 3. But I think bottom of tier 2 is a good spot for Lab. You still see it consistently. And it is still a pretty good deck. Yeah, not so much so that you have to like tech back row removal. But I don't think that was even the case when it first came into Master Duel. But all in all, definitely in a very solid spot. EXO as tier limit especially. Excuse me. As tier limit especially, but kind of graveyard strategies as a whole become less and less frequent, the EXO sister decks in turn also become less and less frequent. Now, to be fair, you don't have to be playing against a graveyard-centric deck to, get wins with Exos, but it obviously helps a lot. Exos are kind of one of those decks where they really just, it depends if the meta favors them or not, right? How much play they're going to see and how good they're going to be in terms of their power level. But Yeah, what was once a tier 3, honestly bordering tier 2 deck when tier limit was at its best is now, I think it's definitely an upper rogue deck still. But I'm probably going to put it around the same level as Black Wings, right? Where I do think that these other decks are a little bit better than it. But I don't know, Exo, it's weird. Exo might actually be better than Tier Limit, the deck it was mainly used to counter in the past, which is kind of wild to me. Again, we'll have to see where Tier Limit shakes out. Mikanko. So when Mikanko came into Master Duel, I was kind of like, oh, you know, they're probably just going to be like a mid to low rogue deck. I don't really expect this deck to do too much, but in terms of popularity, we've actually been seeing it quite a bit in Master Duel, and it makes sense, right? Why it sees more play in Master Duel than it might on, like, TCG or OCG. Sorry, I just need another sip of water real quick here. It definitely makes sense, right? Because in Master Duel, where you can play best of one, and in Mikanko's case, you can guaranteed pretty much always going second, you can always throw down a Kaiju and just run your monster into it for the turn 1 kill there. Whereas in best of 3, you know, not only are you going to have to go first at least one of the games, but your opponent's also going to be onto your strategies. They can play around you more easily by just not playing any monsters or siding hate. That's really, really good against your deck. Decks like Mikanko and Numeron, these going second decks have it definitely a lot harder in best of 3. But here in Master Duel, Mikanko has been seeing a lot more play than I thought it would. I'm going to put Mikanko at the bottom of tier 3, but it's kind of weird. It's weird to put Mikanko there for me because, and I guess I'll just talk about this deck while we're at it, right? I kind of think Mikanko and Numeron are just, they're obviously not the same deck. Like, they do have differences in how they play, but I kind of think they're pretty much the same deck, right? Like, they have generally the same strategy, even down to, like, wanting to run into a Kaiju, and in that regard, I kind of fail to see how they're not, like, on the exact same power level. I think Mikanko is just more popular because it's the newer deck, and it's the prettier one as well, let's be honest, but Numeron, I'm going to put in, like, mid? I don't know, it's kind of like, Numeron and Stun are kind of, like, the same to me, where, I don't know, but I think Numeron is at least a little bit more consistent than Stun. Maybe I'm willing to put it a little bit higher, but I think Mikanko, I think it does have a lot of new deck hype behind it. I think over time, like on the next tier list, probably we'll see Mikanko go down to like upper rogue, but who knows, I could be wrong about that. Naturia Runic. Naturia Runic is actually in a really, really good spot right now. I'm actually going to put it in tier 2, around the same power level as Sprite, maybe a bit higher than Lab. I don't actually see Naturia Runic as much as I think I should, because I think the deck is in a pretty good position in terms of like the fact that, you know, the spell card usage is at an all-time high, obviously because of a deck we'll talk about here in a moment, and on top of that, Ishizu Shufflers, Ishizu cards in general, but the Shufflers, of course, are at an all-time low in terms of how often they're played in the meta. In fact, there's not really any deck that uses the Ishizu cards consistently right now that's really meta relevant. Rip tier limit. So, yeah, Runic variants as a whole are definitely a lot better off than they were, and we've seen Runic Naturia not only have good ladder success, but also good tournament success too. So, yeah, mid to lower tier 2 I think is a good spot for it. Cyber Dragons. I want to talk about Cyber Dragon because they did actually get a new relevant piece of support recently. It's going to be Duality, the quick play spell card, the Ultra from the most recent kind of like anime selection pack, right? Duality actually does offer some pretty good extension for the deck, but I think ultimately it's not enough to, you know, it's not definitely not enough to break it into like tier 3 here. It's definitely not enough, I don't think, even to break into upper rogue, but I think it's still, you know, a pretty solid mid rogue deck. So I don't know, I'll throw Cyber Dragon like right around here. That feels right. Alright, now let's address the fluffy Eevee knockoff in the room, PURRELY. So, when I did my last tier list, I knew PURRELY was coming, and I knew it was going to be relevant, but I had no frame of reference for how relevant it was going to be, because I never played the deck, and PURRELY is one of those decks you do kind of have to play to really get a good idea of what it's about. PURRELY does, of course, have new deck hype behind it, kind of like Mikanko does, but honestly, unlike Mikanko, I think that the new deck hype does not necessarily push it above where it would be normally. I do think we're seeing a meta where PURRELY is the top tier 1 deck right now. It's definitely not by as much of a margin as, Tier Limit has been in the past or other meta decks may have been in the past, but honestly, PURRELY is a very, very, very consistent deck. I think that's what really speaks to its, like, Tier 1 upper, like, not just Tier 1, but, like, top deck status right now, right? Is the fact that the deck is not only very consistent, but also has really solid both going first and going second plays, right? If you go first, you make a giant X PURRELY Nor. If you go second, you do the at PURRELY Happiness OTK, and neither are particularly difficult to do once you know how to pilot the deck well. So, yeah, PURRELY in the hands of a good pilot. I will say it is a very skill-intensive deck. There's a lot of decision-making to do literally every single time you activate a card. But, yeah, I think with a good pilot, PURRELY is definitely stronger than just about any other deck in the format right now. Again, not by as much as, it might seem, but it is definitely up there. Sky Striker, it's, I think, underrepresented. I think with the Bystials and the Ishizu Shufflers not seeing that much play right now, it's a good time for Sky Striker to potentially be able to shine. There's just not really that many people on it. To be fair, though, like, if you're going to play a going second deck, it's kind of like, why wouldn't you play Mikonkos, especially in this meta where, Mikonkos are really favored for playing Kaijus, where Sky Striker is a going second deck that doesn't really want to play Kaijus that badly. So, like, they have an archetype Kaiju and you don't even use it. So, Sky Strikers are going to be, like, I don't know. I think they're going to be, like, lower, like, mid to lower Rogue. I do feel they're probably underrepresented, but again, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, it's kind of like, why wouldn't you just play a better going second deck? I don't know. 4 strikers, but they're still fine overall. Rika Sun Avalon is actually another one I kind of feel like I got wrong on the last tier list. I thought it was going to be a tier 3 deck, and I think it probably is, but I think I had it in, like, upper tier 3. I'm going to put it in, like, lower tier 3. Borderline Rogue. I just never see it, You just don't really see Rika Sun Avalon that often. I think it's kind of constantly doing this dance between lower tier 3 and upper Rogue, but overall is definitely still a more than fine. It is a good deck. Kashtira, I think Kashtira, in my opinion, has seen a kind of a nosedive in terms of popularity. Kashtira absolutely had new deck hype behind it, with only the first wave support. I have to throw in that caveat, because once we get the second wave support, it'll shoot Kashtira up to a tier 1 deck. It'll kind of do the opposite of what Tier Limit did, where Tier Limit dropped from tier 1 to Rogue. Kashtira, I'm going to put in Rogue, but once it gets its new support, and I'll put it like... it is still upper Rogue. I'll put it like right here. But once Kashtira gets its new support, you better believe it's going to be a tier 1 deck. Alright, Runic Sprite. Runic Sprite, I don't think is either the best Sprite or Runic variant, but is definitely still a very good deck in its own right. I'm going to put it down here in tier 3. I think it's about on par with, like, where Punk and Flow are. It might be a bit worse than those two, but I don't know. This might be a bit biased. Maybe it is better than Punk by a slight margin. But again, I think that these tier 3 decks are all just generally in the same power level. But yeah, Runic Sprite. It's not a bad Runic variant. It's not a bad Sprite variant. But I do think that there are better variants in either category. Scareclaw continues to be a pretty decent deck, and we'll actually get some new support in the future. I don't think it's going to, like, catapult it up to, like, tiered status, but it's definitely not a bad investment if you want to try it. It does have a secret pack now, which is nice. I think it's pretty much on par. Whoa, it's definitely not in tier 3. I think it's like Blackwing, Marine Sis level. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good spot for Scareclaw. Trap Tricks, I put at the top of Rogue, and I'll put it still towards the top of Rogue. I'll put it, like, down here, right? Definitely still a fine deck, but if you're going to play a back row based deck, I think that Lab is definitely the way to go there. Dragon Link. So Dragon Link, I do think is still a tier 1 deck, but it's definitely starting to peter off a little bit in terms of, I think, just the number of people playing it. I think it's the fact that PURRELY is better. I think it's also the fact that Dragon Link can sometimes have a bit of a time outing, like, Towers monsters, which PURRELY obviously makes very consistently, and like I said, earlier in the video, decks that can make Towers monsters decks like these that can make Towers monsters tend to do pretty well against decks like Dragon Link. Although Dragon Link might have an obvious set that I'm just not thinking of off the top of my head. I know there's, like, Underworld Goddess that it plays sometimes, but in any case, I think that it's still a tier 1 deck, but you can definitely see it starting to peter out. I wouldn't be surprised if you know, especially by the time Cashier gets its new support, we're definitely going to see it go back down the tier list here. Heroes, still a very solid tier 1, or not tier 1, Jesus, no, a rogue deck. I really love Heroes as an archetype. They're historically probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite archetype, but definitely been a hot meta since they've been tier 1. When were Heroes ever tier 1, actually? Have they ever been? Beyond, like, you know, Destiny Hero stuff back in the day? I don't know, who knows, but... Okay, just 3 more decks to cover. Let's cover a couple of Sprite variants. Tri-Brigade Sprite is, I think, a pretty solid tier 3 deck. I don't think it's as good as... I don't know, is it a tier 3 deck? It might actually just be Rogue. I'm going to put Tri-Brigade Sprite at the top of Rogue, and honestly, I'm going to throw Twin Sprite next to it. I do think that these are both very, very solid decks in their own right, but, you know, if you're going to be playing Sprite, there are already a couple of better Sprite variants to play, and this is really more if you're interested in playing Tri-Brigade or Live Twin. I think combining either of those decks with Sprite is the way to play them, so... I'll put them at the top of Rogue. I'd say Tri-Brigade Sprite is debatably the bottom of tier 3. It's really, really close, kind of like we guess on Avalon and I think Mikako are, but yeah, I'll just go ahead and leave it here at upper Rogue next to Twin Sprite. And finally, Valance. Valance is still running around doing its Valance things, mostly putting out Fossil Dino plus Secret Village, which is like, oh. But, you know, definitely still, of course, a good deck. It's a rogue deck. It's definitely among these ones that are like favorite if you know them well, but I do think it is in a better position than them. I'll put it in upper rogue up here. And there it is. There is our filled out tier list for the current metagame. So I'm looking it over once again, and I think I'm pretty satisfied with where I've put everything. Let me know if you have any opinions on where I've put everything. Whether you agree or disagree, I would love to hear from you in the comments section below. And I think that's going to go ahead and about do it for this video. So let us move now to our outro. Alright everybody, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you for watching it all the way to the very end. That means a whole lot to me, and it's also a fantastic way to support the channel. And if you're interested in supporting the channel in other ways besides YouTube, there are plenty of ways to do that. If you check out the description below, you'll find a bunch of links down there. One of them goes to my Patreon. You're actually seeing the names of everyone subscribed to the Patreon on the screen right now. So if you're interested in getting your name in the credits here at the end, if you want to see more daily Master Duel content, or if you're interested in one-on-one private coaching sessions, I offer all of that on Patreon. I also stream live on Twitch. Feel free to go ahead and click that link and follow and or subscribe there. I also have the Discord community, if you want to follow that link, where hundreds of duelists have already signed up. Free to join, and you can just come hang out, talk about the game, and chill in general. Final link that's going to be in the description is my Twitter. You can follow that if you want some more notifications of what's happening with the channel. So, all in all, thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic day.